I'm just going to do a brief introduction of my friend and colleague, Jennifer Ballentine. So Jennifer is the executive director of the CSU Shiley Haynes Institute for Palliative Care, which provides high quality online education for clinicians and program administrators in palliative care nationally and across the globe. Jennifer is a longtime palliative care educator and advocate, frequent conference speaker. She's a published author and a failed anthropologist who retains an interest in how humans use and abuse language to shape reality. So Jennifer, thank you so much for joining us. If we were in person, I could give you a lay, but you'll have to pretend.
Well,
so
thanks so much.
Thank you very much and welcome.
Thank you all. It's great to be here. I love, spreading the word and seeing my colleagues across the globe. I wish I could be there in person, but obviously I'm not. So I'm just going to quickly share my screen here. Okay, excellent. So this is a presentation that I recently gave at the Coalition for Compassionate Care of California conference. It kind of brings together a number of issues that are top of mind for me a lot of the time. So diving in, with all the innovations and technical advances in palliative care, so much of the success or failure of what we do really depends on what we say and how we say it, how we talk about each other, our patients, and our work. I dare say over the past year and a bit of all the Zoom meetings and battlefield promotions to telehealth, we've all learned a few lessons about the importance of language in palliative care. This past year has also reinvigorated conversations about how we talk about and to people other than ourselves, other races, ethnicities, cultures, gender and sexual orientations, political affiliations, ages, and states of health. These conversations are not new. Sources for this presentation extend back into the 1980s, and evidently the conversations are not over yet. So here's my take on just a few of the persistent problems that I think we need to be cognizant of. Our objectives for today are, first of all, to identify the possibility for harm inherent in our use of certain words or phrases in the delivery of palliative care, to critically evaluate our own use of such words or phrases, and to apply tips and tactics to change our language in order to minimize that harm and maximize respectful and authentic communication. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. No, this isn't the start of a Sunday sermon, and I'm not going to be preaching to you, but it is possibly the most succinct and eloquent statement of how language shapes our reality, how language is our reality. Words create meaning and even being, and how we use them, which ones we use, to whom, and which contexts matters deeply. What we know of others is largely based on what they tell us, or what others tell us and how they say it. Even our experience of emotions and observations of behavior require interpretation and the stories we tell ourselves and each other about what it means. Likewise, what we know of ourselves is based in communication contexts. How we're spoken to, what words are used, shape self-image and identity. Here's another quotable quote. You know where I'm going with this, right? So why don't you take yourselves off mute and say this one with me? Ready? Sticks and stones may break my bones, but words
can never
hurt me.
Anyone want to call BS? Words can and do hurt. In the clinical context, when emotions are fraught, time is short, stakes are high, such as they have been in every ED and ICU across the country this past year and a half, what gets said by whom about what takes on even greater significance. In the waiting area, the ED, the exam room, the ICU, the SNF, the palliative care or hospice visit, all we know of patients must be communicated quickly, often by others. and what we say back matters. We often think of iatrogenic harm as pain, injury, or illness brought about by the actions of clinicians, either as an inherent byproduct of treatment intended for good, or careless behavior, or even sometimes malpractice. But by definition, iatrogenic harm can also result from the words of clinicians, from what we say and how we say it to patients and their family members. When I was 15, my father, a sophisticated and accomplished international lawyer with a taste for Glenfiddich and a great argument, had a massive stroke. My mother was asked to consent to surgery to remove the clot that was blocking his carotid artery. Ever after, all she could ever remember from that panicky encounter was overhearing the surgeon say, "We got to get busy if we're going to keep this clown alive." Words matter. So today, we're going to be looking at 3 problems of language in palliative care, 3 of likely gazillions, and 3 I had a hard time choosing. Here are 3 problems. First of all, elder speak and its negative effects on patients, residents of care facilities, and family members, neighbors, and colleagues, and those who care for them. Matters of gender in the experience of illness and talking about it, which have implications for treatment and care, as well as public messaging and even marketing of hospice and palliative care services. And finally, euphemisms and their cousins, dysphemisms and medical jargon, all of which complicate and cloud our ability to speak and hear clearly. A few years ago, before the pandemic, I had, shall we say, an episode that was just unusual and uncomfortable enough that I thought I ought to get it checked out. So I went to urgent care after work, by that time, of course, feeling fine, and they started in on a battery of tests, all normal, except for one, which had to be repeated in several hours to determine if the results were an anomaly or a problem. By that time, of course, urgent care was closing, so I got my first ride in an ambulance. I was transported to a nearby ED. It was a Friday night, so of course the joint was jumping, and as my case was a matter of just waiting, I got parked in the hall. Eventually, a nurse came by and started to unbrake my gurney and seemed ready to set off down the hall. When I asked, I thought very politely, "Can you tell me where we're going?" Doctor ordered a chest x-ray. Being a reasonably well-informed and attentive patient with an aversion to unnecessary radiation, I wasn't sure this was right. Perhaps not as politely as I could have, I asked, "Why am I getting a chest x-ray? I thought I was just waiting on a test result." Not skipping a beat and already zooming off down the hall, she replied, "Oh, sweetie, I don't know why. I just carry out the orders." Oh my God, I thought, I've been sweetied. I must now be officially old. My next reply was somewhere well south of polite or patient. So what's going on here? The nurse, no doubt, overworked, overstressed, underpaid, and disrespected herself, had lapsed into elder speak, which is characterized by diminutives such as missy, honey, dearie, or my favorite, young lady, collective pronouns, tag questions, directive statements, and worst of all, secondary baby talk with an elevated pitch and volume and sing-songy cadence, simple vocabulary, and sentence structure. Other typical features of elder speak include repetition, interrupting, speaking too loudly, talking over or past the person, not responding to their questions or concerns, and sometimes outright derogatory remarks. And then we have, this is where I had gotten to. So we have our collective pronouns, tag questions, directive statements, and secondary baby talk. It's not just women who get this, but men as well. Men are called sugar, buddy, handsome, big guy. As most personal care providers are women, sometimes there's an undertone of flirtiness or even overt sexualizing or infantilizing or Phrases such as, "Oh, you don't need to do that," take away a man's agency, reducing him to the status of a small, helpless child. Studies of communication styles in nursing facilities have found them to be predominantly task-oriented, impersonal, assuming and encouraging dependency, and that secondary baby talk comprised 20% of staff-resident interactions. From interviews with 33 residents at 4 public care facilities, researchers found that the majority of residents experienced ageist language daily. More than 2/3 provided examples of controlling language or attitudes, interruptions, authoritative tone, ignoring questions, baby talk, and infantilizing behavior, such as not even being given choices in activities or even what to wear. There are real age-related communication complications, of course, such as hearing loss, verbal processing delays, difficulty decoding nonverbal behaviors, lowered ability to track conversational flow, all of which is made worse by medications, fatigue, and decreased concentration. So some elder speak is accounted for by a type of over-accommodation to real or perceived sensory or cognitive losses on the part of elders, which basically means talking too loud, too close, too simply, and too often. Some over-accommodation can be effective and polite even, but it's easily overdone. For anyone, a move to an assisted living or residential care disrupts continuity of self, biography, and environment. Especially in those not naturally occurring communities, social ties rely on very little other than communication. Elder speak and the resulting effects can actually cause communication breakdowns and problem behaviors, even for cognitively intact elders. Language that is perceived as patronizing and demeaning is actually harder to understand. Elders, as a consequence, feel dumb, dismissed, and demeaned. As they internalize stereotypes, they lose self-respect. Pushback is discouraged or made impossible by power differentials. Staff have power over residents' and patients' care and comfort, and even to some degree, their placement. Elders don't want to make trouble, and thus are disempowered. Or in an effort to take back some portion of power, they become defiant, resisting every interaction. The situation is even worse for those with dementia. Behavior such as aggression, withdrawal, vocal outbursts, wandering, AKA resistive behavior, degrades care, adding to stress and decline in residents and to stress, burnout, and turnover among staff, which also increases the cost of care by 25 to 35%. These resistive behaviors intensify during personal care activities, and guess what? Elder speak intensifies during personal care activities. Elder speak reinforces dependency, engenders isolation and depression, and contributes to a spiral of decline. It's a classic vicious cycle. Age-related dependence provokes a demeaning rhetorical over-accommodation, which in turn provokes resistance, defiance, and depression. Elder speak is especially problematic in residential care, but it can be problematic in any clinical encounter, in any situation where the elder is in a dependent or lower status relationship with the younger person. Effective communication is vital to outcomes, from understanding the directions for medication to supporting collaboration, hope, and personal dignity. Poor communication can result in costly errors, poor quality of life, and outcomes. In studies of physician-patient encounters, younger physicians are often less respectful of older patients. They spend less time in the visit and conduct less thorough examinations. This can lead to reciprocal disrespect on the part of the elder toward the physician, leading them to withhold information and distance themselves from the encounter or refuse to engage in therapeutic collaboration on the part of both. Results can be bad all the way around, from dissatisfaction with the encounter to actual life endangerment. Elders place a high value on the social aspects of communication encounters. Their communication is overall less utilitarian, instrumental, and transactional. It's worthwhile remembering that for some elders, a good deal of their social lives take place in the doctor's office, or at least used to. Now it takes place on televisits. An elder patient's willingness to take the doctor's advice and follow the recommended regimen depends on the quality of the encounter. If the elder is respected and treated with courtesy and kindness, outcomes improve. Making special efforts to appropriately and respectfully accommodate elder communication needs can pay off with higher satisfaction, more referrals, better outcomes, and even increased business. The negative consequences of elder speak are well recognized and have been called out in the clinical and practice literature since at least the 1980s, and nevertheless, the problems persist. We can begin to identify some emerging alternatives, improvements, and even best practices. The communication enhancement of aging model devised by Johnston and Womack in 2015 recommends, wait for it, adjusting communication to individual style, needs, attributes of individuals rather than groups. Especially in residential care, extra effort toward genuine communication and attention should be made to help elders adjust and find meaning in change. Other best practices include becoming aware of and reducing ageist communication, styles and stereotypes, creating a culture of open, honest, and genuine communication, exercising empathy, friendliness, and humor, answering questions honestly and respectfully, engaging in informal communication, just like chit chat, not just transactional or directive statements, developing unique relationships with each patient, genuine attention to personal history and identity. Authentic communication includes truly social conversation, taking sincere interest in the person and their lives, which is all just a very long and pedantic way of saying, talk to your patients as if they are people. When this happens, studies have shown that elders respond better to care and live longer. Collaborative rather than combative relationships are formed, and positive effects extend to staff who find more meaning and pleasure in their work, improve job satisfaction and retention. So watch your mouth. Good care depends on it. In the late summer of 2003, my stepfather, then 78 and in robust health, started experiencing digestive problems. His appetite was off, he lost some weight, and his throughput was suffering. An attempt at an endoscopy was aborted by a troubling EEG result. He was instructed to watch his symptoms and check back with his doctors in mid-October. He was feeling better by then, so he blew it off. A few days after Christmas, my mother called me in a panic because John had passed out at the breakfast table. She called 911. John was transported and immediately admitted to the ICU with a severe case of sepsis. Long story short, the presumptive diagnosis was bile duct cancer, resulting in a complete blockage of the bile ducts. Amazingly, surgery to place stents was a success, and John went to rehab, determined to get home by the Super Bowl. He did. And the next day, my mother ended up in the ED herself with a pulse ox in the 60s from a massive pneumonia. John's diagnosis was unequivocally terminal. All his doctors said so, often and clearly. High doses of lactulose were keeping the toxins at a barely tolerable level. Not a long-term solution. And it came with some pretty nasty, messy side effects, especially for someone sharing a house with a spouse recovering from a massive pneumonia and getting IV antibiotics. It was a grim scene. Even after a family meeting with an incredibly skilled and warm PA who explained that the situation and strongly recommended hospice, John just didn't get it. His daughter flew in from Salt Lake City, and she and I sat him down in the kitchen to explain that hospice would provide excellent care, would address his pain and symptoms, keep him comfortable, clean, and at home as long as possible, and, by the way, support his wife, my mother, in her caregiving challenges. He was having none of it. He said his brother, older brother, mind you, was happy running errands for him, and all he needed was to get a little stronger, and he had every intention of being back up in the mountains fishing by summer. Tragically, it wasn't until I took moves to remove my mother from her own house because the situation had become dangerous to her that he finally consented, after a puff on his pipe and a ramble in the yard with his son, to inpatient hospice care. I got to thinking, What was it about hospice that John so resisted? Was there something in how we presented it to him that didn't resonate or speak to his needs? What magic words did his son have that we hadn't had? Is the whole hospice and palliative care model, or how we talk about it, not serving men as well as women? Being the SWAT that I am, I turned to the literature and found there's precious little discussion of how men and women differently or similarly approach the end of life and how palliative care might meet their respective needs. I'll just mention that in refreshing my research for this talk, almost 20 years later, there is still precious little work being done in this area, and most of it in the UK. In fact, just this year, this article was published in the Journal of Palliative Care and Social Practice. Okay, so I'm not crazy about the metaphor in the title, speaking of dysphemisms, but the point is that still very little attention is being paid to matters of gender in palliative care. The article concludes, if palliative care is to meet its aspirations of providing universal benefit, it urgently needs to address a range of gender inequalities currently reproduced at the level of the laboratory all the way through to government departments. If anyone's looking for a fruitful area of future research, may I recommend this? For our purposes, first questions first. Are hospice and palliative care serving men as well as women? Percentage-wise, there's a whopping 16-point gap between male and female hospice patients in 2017. 58% were female, 42% male. On the other hand, there's a 12-point gap in the overall over 65 population in the same year, 56% female, 44% male, which means men are really only slightly underrepresented in hospice. So what about palliative care? Data from the CAPC registry, which is mostly derived from inpatient palliative care programs, suggests that men are slightly overrepresented by about 5% in receiving palliative care consults. However, the 2020 article I mentioned cited a study that found that women were 3 times more likely than men to consider palliative care, even when controlling for disease factors, age, race, education, and financial strain. We also know from the research that men are more likely to want aggressive care and life-sustaining treatment. Men are overall less accepting of the hospice concept. And when they do enroll, they enroll on average about 5 days later than women do. Before we go any further, it's important to issue some caveats and cautions about gender in general. According to sociologists, gender is a fundamental feature in identity, self-presentation, and interaction. Gender and biological sex are not the same. Sex refers to biological differences between men and women, including chromosomes, sex organs, hormonal profiles, and other discernible physiological differences. Gender is a social construct relating to roles, behaviors, attitudes, and presentation. Gender is not a binary phenomenon, but exists along a continuum. Definitions and expressions of gender are strongly influenced by racial, cultural, and historical factors. Men and women experience the world differently through different interpretive frames, moral and ethical structures, ways of doing identity and relationships. These differences may be experientially obvious, but empirically elusive, which means you know it when you see it, but you can't really describe it. These differences strengthen under stress and in situations of emotional vulnerability. And these differences may be more pronounced and entrenched in our older population. To put this in perspective, current 85-year-olds were born in 1936, 75-year-olds in 1946, and 65-year-olds in 1956. In 1936 was the depths of the Depression. Women who had jobs at all mostly worked as teachers, nurses, or in factories. Half the states had laws against married women working. Fortune magazine published a poll in that year asking, do you believe that married women should have a full-time job outside the home? Only 15% of respondents said yes. 1946 saw the debut of the first ever two-piece bathing suit, designed by Louise Réard, modeled in Paris by stripper Micheline Bernardini, because no legitimate model would do it. Because 4 days earlier, the first of 23 tests of American nuclear weapons was detonated at the Bikini Atoll in the South Pacific. The garment was dubbed the Bikini. That box she's holding, by the way, is the package the garment came in. 1956, arguably the year of peak gender role differentiation, I Love Lucy was the #1 hit show. The Dear Abby advice column premiered. Betty Crocker's Good and Easy Cookbook was the #3 nonfiction bestseller after The Holy Bible and The Power of Positive Thinking by Norman Vincent Peale. And in the category of how nothing is ever really new, in 1956, the first conference on the topic of artificial intelligence was held, and an Asian flu pandemic killed 116,000 Americans. These markers are important because for the current phalanxes of elders, their early socialization led to strongly gendered roles. So how does this play out in the experience of illness, and what implications might it have for our provision of palliative care? First of all, in the role of patient, from the scant research there's a cultural assumption that illness is a natural state for women, in part because of the symptomology of menstruation, and in part because of their role as family caregiver for young children. Illness as a phenomenon is gendered female. And for what it's worth, in all major European languages that use gendered nouns, the word for sickness is literally gendered feminine. As patients, women are more subject to chronic and debilitating diseases, more likely to utilize routine care, more adaptable to the role of patient, more familiar with, but equally more critical of healthcare systems. Their visits with doctors are longer. They give long histories with lots of contextual detail and ask many follow-up questions. They do more doctor shopping, and they negotiate the care plan. Their focus in the visit is on the social and communicative aspect. They may not have family caregivers, and thus are more conscious of the caregiving burden. Men, on the other hand, whenever possible, will tend to ignore pain and illness and will often rely on women to monitor, explain, manage, and support their health. The cliche of the wife badgering the husband to just go to the doctor already is rooted in reality. For men, illness and pain are seriously abnormal states. They seek help later, only when symptoms become acute. They suffer higher rates of acute and potentially fatal illness. They are less adaptable to the role of patient and have difficulty ceding personal control. Their visits with doctors tend to be shorter. They present a problem and expect a solution. They're more likely to accept a treatment regimen as proposed or ignore it completely, but they don't negotiate it. Their focus is on the instrumental and functional aspects of the visit. They are more likely to have family caregivers, and thus perhaps less awareness of the emotional burdens, but they may be hypersensitive to the practical burdens, especially financial. As I mentioned, there is some interesting study being done in the UK around the language of pain, analyzing large bodies of text on the basis of the frequency of words and word groupings, or so-called collocations, to identify rhetorical and semantic themes. Such studies of qualitative interviews with patients and natural narratives on social media caregiving sites have turned up some interesting gender differences. Women report pain much more frequently, and also their reports are more frequently ignored, considered exaggerations, or arising from anxiety. Thus, routinely, they are undertreated. A notable example of this, if you've been following, is the story of Selma Blair, who it took her 7 years to get a diagnosis of multiple sclerosis. Women do talk more about pain than men, with a wider ranging vocabulary, ranging from intense to boring. There's a mismatch between women's natural language of pain and the screening instruments such as the McGill Pain Questionnaire. Women don't typically describe pain in sensory terms: shooting, throbbing, stabbing, aching, and so on. They describe it in terms of how it impacts their lives. I can't get out of bed. I can't carry a suitcase. I can't drive. I can't think straight. I can't make love. Women view pain as a problem to be solved, but they see a broad range of possible solutions. They also talk about pain as an experience to be coped with, lived with, and learned from. Men, on the other hand, are socialized to suppress pain. They experience pain as an assault on identity, only reporting it when it becomes unbearable or it has rendered them helpless. Men's reports of pain are infrequent, but almost always extreme. Men are more frequently and immediately referred to specialists. In men's narratives, the most frequently occurring collocation is pain plus absolutely plus excruciating. They also view pain as a problem to be solved, but almost exclusively via medication. Men tend to manage illness by drawing on themselves and professional resources, not so much on social or familial supports. Their coping strategies include keeping a tight control on emotions. Anger and frustration are okay, but sadness and anxiety, not so much. They confide in a small number of safe witnesses, otherwise maintaining an attitude of, nobody really wants to hear about it. Just as women's physical pain is often dismissed, men's emotional pain is often missed. Here are some clues. Men's discussion of illness is dominated by a fraternity style of language, boasting, teasing, swearing, joking, and humor. They use a lot of sports and war metaphors, not just in the context of illness as a battle, but the teamwork, the strategy, practice, mental and physical fitness, and endurance required for it. These tactics can work well for minor ailments, but serious or terminal illness can challenge and undermine this approach. Men also view illness as a problem to be solved, which allows a mind frame of competence and activity. They experience high frustration when the problem can't be solved. So much for the literature. How might this play out in real life? After John's death, I continued to ruminate on our experience. John's hospice social worker and I devised a small-scale qualitative study to try to identify how men and women approach the end of life. Our sample was 25 men, 25 women, age range of 45 to 85, men tending younger. About 4 men and 3 women were non-white. They were all patients of the Denver Hospice. And the questions that we asked was, what do you need at this time of your life? What are your individual goals? What help and support do you want from the care team? Do you want to talk about your feelings or experiences at this time? Is it helpful? And what matters most? The results, interestingly, mirrored the existing literature. In terms of needs at the end of life, men really avoided identifying needs. When pressed, they expressed a higher need to be alone and lower need for contact and connection. They were driven to maintain control and independence. They found comfort in familiar surroundings and routines. Their main desire was to take care of business, financial and legal. Women, on the other hand, identified and expressed a wide range of needs. They were better at naming and claiming their emotions. They were motivated to maintain connection with family and friends. They desired reassurance that their families will be all right. They took comfort from familiar caregivers and loved ones. And they really desired the time to talk about what was happening, to talk through and reach some kind of closure. In terms of goals for the end of life, women tended to set short-term goals. I want to see my daughter at the weekend. They wanted to maintain quality of life, express the desire to adapt to and accept changes. Their goal was to live day to day and not to be a burden to their family and to die peacefully. Men tended to set long-term goals, like John's plan to be back in the mountains fishing by summer. He was motivated to maintain lifestyle, maintain the status quo, expressing a need to endure and get beyond, not to be a burden to family, and to die with dignity. In terms of attitudes toward dying, men reported less fear of dying, but more fear of the unknown. They tended to see dying as a solitary experience. They used distancing, problem solving, and competence coping, expressed more trust in the positive, possibly positive medical outcome. And their distress was deepened by a sense of lack of control over their fate. Women reported more fear of dying, fear of and experience of pain. They were distressed by being abandoned or alone in dying, used emotion-focused coping and meaning-making. They admitted more awareness of medical limitations and burdens, and their distress was deepened by a sense of vulnerability. The key word for both of these sets of results is report. Men may not feel less fear of dying or pain or distress, but they are certainly less likely to report it. What all this tells us is that in general, the end-of-life experience is different for men and women. For men, the emphasis is on control, independence, functionality, competence, and business. For women, the emphasis is on comfort, companionship, conversation, and value. The traditional model of hospice is more naturally aligned with what we might call the feminine perspective. As illness is often gendered female, so is care. From that 2020 article I mentioned, gender norms shape many men and women's perceptions on how they ought to act in the face of illness, in turn shaping what care they receive. To ensure access to palliative care for men, we need a different approach and a different language. For women, we might say, palliative care will control your pain and symptoms so you can keep doing what you do, support your family, ease their burdens, and live well in the moment. For men, we might say, palliative care will keep you in the driver's seat, support your independence and activity, bring expertise to bear on your illness. Both are true, but with a little bit of a different emphasis. So watch your language, from marketing to admissions through the end of service. And now we come to euphemisms. This portion of the talk could be an entire master's program of study and more. The language of healthcare, especially palliative and serious illness and end-of-life care, is positively lousy with euphemisms, dysphemisms, mythphemisms, jargon, and just plain old gobbledygook. It's a wonder we can communicate at all. In preparing this section, I queried my colleagues and connections about their favorite euphemisms, terms of obscurity and confusion. I got quite a list back. And at the very top was palliative care. Oh my God, the time we could spend on that. Every committee, work group, task force I've ever participated in related to palliative care has been at least the first umpteen sessions establishing the definition of palliative care. And invariably, there's some wag at the back who at some point says, no one understands what palliative care means. Or if they do, they think it means hospice and they're dying. We shouldn't call it palliative care. We should call it, and then rattles off a whole bunch of other phrases. Well, instead of spending weeks getting wrapped around that axle, here's all I'm going to say about that.
Hi. We got a call that this house is on fire. How can we be helpful? Well, the house is on fire, but I'm worried if you go in there it might send the wrong message. Wait, what? I'm with the fire department. Yes, I know. I think you could be really helpful, but I think the family might be worried something is wrong if the fire department shows up at their house. But something is wrong. Their house is on fire. Do you think there's any way you could talk to them, but not use the word fire? What? I just think if the family hears the word fire, they might lose hope. But I am with the fire department and I am here to help this family with their fire. Right, totally. I think you could be really helpful, but I'm just not sure this family is in a place where they're ready to meet the fire department right now. Can we call you the water support team?
Enough said? Okay. Oops. Let's try to move past this. Okay, here we go. Here are some other favorites. Other favorite euphemisms of mine: physician-assisted suicide, assisted death, aid in dying, medical aid in dying, death with dignity, palliative sedation, terminal sedation, total sedation, deep continuous sedation, advanced end-stage, terminal, serious, progressive illness, terminal delirium, terminal agitation, diagnosis, prognosis, and the ever-popular battling cancer. Those of you who know me know that I could spend a very long time indeed on physician-assisted suicide and its many cognates, all intentionally crafted to signal philosophical stances as much as describe the practice. By my latest count, there are at least 12 such terms in frequent circulation, making any literature search on the topic a veritable nightmare. So enough said about that. There are two terms, however, that I do think it's worth looking at more closely, as they are fundamental to what we do: dying and care. With all the proliferating vocabulary around assisted death, I find it odd that we can barely bring ourselves to say plain old death, dying, or dead. This wordle was created by CareSearch, a palliative care knowledge network in Flinders University, Australia, based on responses to an activity in a MOOC hosted for Australia's Dying to Know Day. 3,116 participants from 39 countries contributed their favorite euphemisms for dead. The top responses, which you can see as the largest terms in the wordle, include passed away, passed on, gone or gone to heaven, pushing up the daisies, kick the bucket, and my very favorite, carked it. And as you can see from the wordle, there are dozens more, all about being dead, but not a lot about getting there. What are euphemisms for dying? If you can think of any, put them in the chat. What do you think? Can you think of any euphemisms for dying that we use? Last chapter, okay. Coming to the end. It's not easy, is it? Going to Jesus, transition. Okay, yeah, transition is nice and vague. Going home, flying away, fighting. On their last legs, not long for this world, turned her face to the wall. There are a few, but there aren't a lot. If you want a more medical technical term, there's the mother of all oxymorons, actively dying. I remember as a hospice volunteer, the first time I heard this, I thought, what? Actively dying? Excuse me? Okay. Here's another little thought experiment and another opportunity for you to put something in the chat. What do you see in this picture? Just name anything at all that you see in the picture. Snow, winter, footprints, snow. Anything else? Trees, peace. Street lights, yes. Path, cold. Okay, good. And I'm delighted that you all out there in Hawaii recognize snow. Yay! So, but it's interesting. We only have the one word for snow, right? And I'm sure you're familiar with the old saw that the Eskimo have a zillion words for snow, right? Well, maybe not a zillion. It's actually somewhere between 50 and 200. And each one encapsulates snow in a particular form with a particular quality. There are individual words for powder snow, snow that is crusted on the surface, drifting snow, still snow, remembered snow, forgotten snow, snow that falls in large wet flakes, snow that falls in small flakes, snow that falls quickly, snow that falls slowly, snow that is melted and refrozen, snow that has been marked by wolves, snow that has been marked by Eskimo, blowing snow, melted snow, snow in beards, snow mixed with mud, snow mixed with husky dung, snow mixed with the lead husky dung, and so on. As it turns out, as any Colorado ski bum will tell you, there are many, many words for snow in English too, and Scots have upward of 400. However, you want to count the words. The basic insight is that because snow and its infinitely varied qualities are omnipresent in the Arctic experience, Inuit languages evolved many different words to capture these nuances, not just a matter of aesthetics, but survival. An experience that is rich, varied, and important will likely require a rich, varied, and semantically important vocabulary. If we have a word to describe snow that is crusted on top but not soft underneath, we can understand it and all that such snow might mean. If we don't have proper words for dying in all its nuance, variation, and implications, we can't understand it or what it might mean. Or language, euphemistic or plain, is pretty spare when it comes to dying. This is the fundamental insight in an interesting book written by an even more interesting guy. Bart Windrum unpacks this at length in The Promised Land, A Gateway to Peaceful Dying. And I'll give you just a taste. Starting from the observation that our vocabulary for dying is insanely inadequate, Windrum notes that we also therefore have inadequate imagery of dying. Outside of sudden or accidental or intentional death, we can really only imagine two scenarios: hospital ICU or peacefully at home. In the popular imagination, this is an either or: die in the hospital wired up 6 ways from Sunday, or die at home in your own bed. In fact, Windrum notes, a wide range of dying situations is arrayed before us. We've experienced them, we just haven't thought to name them or distinguish among them. Without naming them, we can't imagine them. We can't anticipate them or prepare for them or take steps to avoid or ensure either one of them. We also can't talk about them, which is part of the reason I think we have such a hard time with advanced care planning. Do we fail to distinguish because we lack the language, or do we lack the language because we fail to distinguish? In either case, Windrum proposes the solution is to consider what molds our dying time in general and our dying experiences more specifically, and then assign names describing those experiences. I won't walk you through this whole matrix. It's complex. But in general, it represents a taxonomy of dying that is characterized by, first of all, what's in control: the world at large, the medical technical complex, machinery, the individual person, or a relationship between the person and the provider. And how long will it take? Sudden or quick, stretched out over a long time of decline, or never ending, as in the case of persistent vegetative state? You'll also notice that the matrix takes into account the legal and ethical status of the modes of dying. Just to gloss a few of these terms, in sleep is generally considered the friendly and desirable. This is the I want to die in my sleep. Now I lay me down to sleep, etc. Erroneous are deaths that are precipitated by medical errors in judgment or actual technical errors. Midstream is the roller coaster trajectory of multiple morbidities leading to multiple hospitalizations and interventions, each one less successful than the last. Suspended is the multi-week terminal hospitalization with intensive death-denying medical intervention. Released is Windrum's term for medically aided or self-directed dying shortly after receiving a terminal diagnosis. And collaborative is with meaningful palliative and hospice use. Unfortunately, because it's complex and the language is a tad less than natural, I'm not sure this particular vocabulary will ever catch on. But the basic insight is important. Dying is not all the same for everyone. The experience of illness is not all the same for everyone. But by having paltry language, we have paltry ideas and paltry influence or ability to anticipate and change where we might end up and how we might end up there, or to help our patients and their families understand where they are, that dying is a process, not an event, that it might span days to years, that choices made all along the line can have an effect. Now let's talk about our final euphemism, care. Care is probably one of the most insidious euphemisms we ever use without ever thinking about it in that way. A euphemism, let's remember, is defined as a mild or indirect word or expression substituted for one considered to be too harsh or blunt when referring to something unpleasant or embarrassing. Care. What's unpleasant or embarrassing that care is covering up? What is care? The original meaning of the Indo-European verb was bewail the deceased. Care is suffering of mind, grief, a disquieted state of mixed uncertainty, apprehension and responsibility, painstaking or watchful attention, regard coming from a desire or esteem, charge or supervision as in under the care of, a person or thing that is an object of attention, anxiety, or solicitude. Care is a face worn by years of anxiety and apprehension. Concern implies personal interest, relation, or affection. The verb to care means to feel trouble or anxiety, to feel interest or concern, to give care, to be concerned about. Excuse me. How do we use care in healthcare? With abandon. Let's look at a few of these more closely, starting with healthcare. As often and thoughtlessly as we throw this one around, it's actually a fairly new coinage. Here's a graph showing how a phrase or variations on a phrase have occurred in a corpus of books over the selected years. It's hard to see that healthcare made its debut around 1909, and it begins to pick up in usage around 1980 and really take off in the 90s and 2000s. With no proof at all, I suggest that the coinage of healthcare was a deliberate introduction of a euphemism, probably by some marketing whiz, exactly to communicate a kind of attitude or stance of the provider or service as caring, with all the connotations of concern, anxiety, affection, and regard. To which in the 1990s, the beloved Walter Cronkite retorted that the American healthcare system is neither healthy, caring, nor a system. How many of these terms actually refer to care as in painstaking or watchful attention, or regard coming from esteem? How many of us, when in the care of our healthcare providers, feel that we are an object of attention, anxiety, or solicitude? How many of us as healthcare providers believe that we are offering our patients care, as in feeling trouble or anxiety, feeling interest or concern, feeling a troubled state of mind because of personal interest, relation, or affection? Probably a lot of you, and I'll give you that, because I believe that palliative care folks on the whole do exemplify the care in healthcare. But too often, the net effect we have on an awful lot of people is just one of who cares and don't care. I don't mean to get down on all of you for the good work you do with your full hearts and overworked souls, but fully half of these words denote experiences that have nothing to do with care of any kind. Care in these terms is a euphemistic, misleading stand-in for treatment. For instance, standard of care is a legal term used primarily in medical malpractice suits to define a minimally acceptable treatment, usually in the context of a violation thereof, as in did not meet the standard of care. The standard of care is defined as appropriate treatment based on scientific evidence and collaboration between medical professionals involved in the treatment of a given condition. Treatment, not care. These concepts stretch back to the 13th century Catholic moral theology and were fully articulated by Pope Pius XII in the late 1950s to make distinctions between ordinary measures, which are based on medication or treatment, directly available and can be applied without incurring severe pain, costs, or other inconveniences, but which give the patient justified hope for a commensurate improvement in his health. Extraordinary measures are those that are based on medication or treatment, which cannot be applied without incurring severe pain, costs, or other inconveniences. Treatment, not care, no care in sight. Or how about these? Excuse me? This is really heading into the realm of oxymorons because care is never futile or non-beneficial. Futile treatment, non-beneficial treatment. If we start talking about care as being futile, what message are we sending to our patients? Worst of all is this: withdraw care. When and why would we ever withdraw care? This is the ultimate extension of the absurdity of calling treatment care. And it is not only confusing, but I would say harmful to patients, families, and ourselves as providers to not be more careful about the distinction. It hurts everyone to imply that care is something that is futile or non-beneficial or something that can be withdrawn. I'm guessing all of this is understood by anyone in palliative care. After all, we're the communication geniuses. But wait, our use of care can be just as bad. Comfort care. Now we're getting into it. This one drives me nuts, in part because it's so often used in nursing facilities to suggest that the resident is now getting some range of treatments or attention that they weren't getting before, or worse, that they are now qualified for a defined benefit that does not exist. That isn't euphemism, ladies and gents, that's fraud. Several years ago, Drew Raziel, a palliative care physician at the University of Minnesota Health, wrote an excellent 4-part series of blogs in PalliMed called Against Euphemism, in which he tackled comfort care, compassionate extubation, palliative sedation, and assisted death. I highly recommend it. Dr. Raziel nicely articulates the other part of why comfort care bugs me. He admits he uses the term, as do many of us. He says, comfort care is widely recognized amongst us healthcare professionals, and replacing it with the huge mouthful of a plan of care in a patient who is dying in which the goals of care are to prevent and alleviate suffering, but not to prolong life or the dying process, is irksome and runs the risk of the people who you're talking with deciding you're a pompous jackass. So yes, he says, I say it, but only internally, and I treat it as jargon, dirty, dirty jargon, never to be spoken in the presence of patients and families. Comfort care reinforces a false dichotomy between cure and comfort. It implies a binary choice between the two. Which would you rather, be comfortable or get cured? When the entire point of palliative care is to maybe do both. Okay, goals of care. My opinion, this one is almost worse. And it's a tricksy one. Since forever, as I've made presentations about palliative care, I've emphasized that what we understand is an important and obvious distinction between the aims of treatment and the goals of care. The aims of treatment, I intone, are the physician's medical therapeutic objectives, while the patient's goals of care are personal goals, which the treatment will ideally enable them to reach. The physician wants to control the patient's diabetes. The patient wants to keep their eyesight and limbs intact. The surgeon wants to repair the ACL. The patient wants to climb Kilimanjaro. Often the aims of treatment and goals of care are so aligned there's no daylight between them. However, they can widely diverge. For instance, the aims of treatment for a bone marrow transplant are to eradicate cancer cells once and for all. That this objective may only be obtained by a battery of painful and invasive procedures, including high-dose chemotherapy and/or radiation, itself euphemistically called conditioning, God help us, likely severe side effects, near total physical and social isolation, high risks of death or therapeutic failure is all just unfortunate background noise. Meanwhile, the patient may have entirely different goals of care, What the patient desires above all is to get strong and healthy enough to go home, enjoy their garden, walk their dog, and get their affairs in order. These goals of care are what we palliative care folks are dedicated to helping patients uncover and prioritize, and then to devise a care plan to achieve. This goals of care conversation represents a moment of choice that often entails refusing the aims of treatment in favor of the goals of care. Except that's not at all what is heard or understood by our patients and families. They don't get the distinction between aims of treatment and goals of care. They don't get that this conversation can mean we're at a crossroads. Katie Butler, journalist and author of Knocking on Heaven's Door and the Art of Dying Well, defines goals of care as priorities, what really matters to you when doctors know they can no longer cure you. Another physician I know has put it less gently. The goals of care conversation is a come to Jesus talk with a patient or family, conveying that realistically the aims of treatment can't be achieved, and the need now is to focus on other goals for the best quality of life. Yet another wag I know has called it the way doctors deliver bad news without actually having to say it's bad. By calling things care that have nothing to do with care or only to do with treatment, we are stacking the rhetorical deck. Treatment has benefits and burdens, risks and rewards. It is subject to scrutiny and research, critique and improvement, success and failure. It is something that patients can refuse. But care? Who would refuse care? To my way of thinking, care has been weaponized to disguise a host of iatrogenic verbal invasions as expressions of concern. By wielding care in this way, we are all but daring our patients and families to not feel regarded with esteem, affection, and concern, when instead they are frightened, confused, and traumatized by our attentions. I suggest that we be more scrupulous, more careful in our use of the word care, that we reserve it for occasions and approaches that really do more closely resemble what the word means. Please watch your mouth. The morals of this very long story: words create reality. Words can hurt your patients and you. Don't talk like a baby to anyone past their first birthday. Listen for how people, men and women, talk about their illness and pain, respond to what they mean and need. Expand your vocabulary of dying, and only say care when you mean it. As the author Neil Gaiman wrote, the view changes from where you are standing. Words can wound, and wounds can heal. All of these things are true. Thank you for your attention.
So we are clapping for you, Jennifer. Wow, thank you very much. That was very thought-provoking. You did such a great job. Thank you.
Well, thank you all for your attention. I know it's a little bit tough to keep it up on a Friday afternoon when you'd rather be at the beach, maybe. Thursday afternoon.
Well, the good news is it's only Thursday,
okay,
so
there you go.
We have a whole nother day to work.
What do I know?
Yep, exactly. So I'm interested if people have any questions or comments. You might have seen, Jennifer, there was an interesting discussion going on about a lot of the words for rain in Hawaii.
Oh, okay.
The valley that I live in, we have something called kuahini, which we have right now outside. And as Leilani said, next valley over, totally different word for rain. So, but
awesome.
That's not in English, and that's not to your point about the words around dying. So
well, but it is to the point, because you guys have a lot of different kinds of rain, and it's an important feature in your cultural and physical landscape. So it is very much to the point.
Yeah.
Fascinating.
We also have lots of words for wind, different winds.
Oh, okay. Interesting. So I'm very interested to know from you, one section that I did leave out because it really could be an hour and a half all by itself is the influence of culture on elder speak. And oftentimes when I've given this presentation, there'll be someone in the audience from the American South who will say, "What are you talking about? We say missy, dearie, honey, sweetie all the time, and no one ever takes offense," because that's part of the culture in the American South. And certainly different ethnicities have different approaches to this, so I'm interested if in Hawaii you have particular phrases that you use for your elders, or if you resonated with that part of the talk at all.
All elders are
I'm really,
identical. Yeah, and some tourists find it offensive, but it's a sign of respect.
Auntie and uncle.
Well, auntie, was the
Auntie
word?
and uncle are.
Okay.
yeah, we
We
say
say
that
auntie.
often. Auntie and uncle is a sign of respect for people. So I could see how outsiders wouldn't like it, but for us, anyone else have a comment about that? We use these terms of dear, or we use terms like that, which I wouldn't, there's a way to say it in a bad way, like you were saying, and there's another way that's more, that I could see could be seen as caring and compassionate. So I was wondering if other people have a feeling about that.
This is Tanya. I find it quite interesting because in our multicultural community, there is some acceptance and understanding of these different, I'd call them endearments, so that the auntie and uncle thing is definitely one of them. But there also needs to be some thought and understanding of when it's appropriate to use it. And that's how I understand what Jennifer is saying, working in the healthcare industry, it has been so obvious when you see it being misused, as she experienced in the ER. But you can go someplace and you think that, okay, yeah, it's okay to call them auntie, and then you use the term and it's taken in offense by someone because, for instance, just for me, if I go to the grocery store and somebody that looks my age or older than me calls me auntie, that requires some kind of a snide remark or something, call me sister, don't call me auntie. But I know that it's so important, and I wanted to just comment on that, is that recognizing the appropriateness of the words that we use, where we're using it, is so important a skill to teach, as well as when to use the words. I absolutely love this presentation because it speaks so much. Even the words that we're using sounds like it's pun intended. It speaks so much to the issue. It really does, because most people, and this is something that how I have treated everything that I do within the work that I do, is everybody has a story. Everybody is important. Everybody has a purpose. And for us to find ways to acknowledge that and highlight for them that, especially when we're in the time of their life when they're close to death, so that it's not like, oh, what was this all for? It was futile. To me, the most beautiful moments in caring for patients in the dying process is acknowledging them as still valuable, recognizing that even up to the end, they have something to contribute. And so I'm just floored by this. I'd like to go off to the side and journalize for right now. So I'll be quiet now.
Well, thank you for that.
Thank you, Tanya. Do others have a comment? Things that resonate from the patients you care for or the culture that you come from? what about the worst? Rachel, did you want to say something?
Yeah, Jennifer, I was particularly, as someone who's an end-of-life educator, the portion that about the difference between male and female approaches was very mind expanding and super excellent. And I'm thinking about a patient that I have right now, a man, and how everything you said was totally applicable to him and how I might alter my approach to honor that. Thank you. That was so valuable.
Well, thank you. And as I said, it's an area that is surprisingly neglected. There really isn't much about it at all. And I think perhaps because it's not fashionable to claim that there are differences between men and women, and because truthfully our understanding of gender has so expanded. I mean, it's interesting when I think back to when I was first doing this work, when we did that study at the Denver Hospice, it was 2004, 2005, and there just wasn't the understanding of the spectrum of gender identity and gender orientation and the idea, non-binary just wasn't even in anybody's thought process at all, But I do still think that there are differences between men and women, and there are differences, particularly in this older generation, of which I'm kind of a member, which is a little bit of a surprise. But it's real, and it's something that I think does require a little bit of thought and extra attention to language. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
So Angie had raised her hand.
Yeah, I just think that we naturally, when we deal with children or teenagers, we automatically would phrase things differently and approach it differently. And we don't think about male and female. Possibly we need to just be more conscious of those differences so that it becomes more automatic, like we would adjust our approach depending upon other differences. And I really liked when Jennifer, made the difference of what's the biological sex and then what somebody identifies as. And I think right now that's going to become more important. Not that it wasn't important, but we're more aware of it now. So that's something we're not used to, that we're going to have to take into consideration and just become really aware of, because that could make, I think, all the difference in caring for a patient. If it is a man and you're trying to approach them as you would a very macho man, and this person isn't identifying as a man, you're not going to have the rapport, or they're not going to have respect for you based on how you're treating them or how you're talking to them. So
really, it all just comes down to that fundamental insight that encounter people as who they are. Spend a little time to get to know them as an individual. Ask how they want to be addressed.
Yes.
Ask them, how should I address you? I occasionally bristle when someone who's 10 years old calls me by my first name. On the other hand, Mrs. Ballentine doesn't really, chuff me either, so, it's.
But I think it's about listening and meeting people where they are and realizing that there's no cookie cutter. Exactly. In any of us, for any situation, it's not cookie cutter, but especially in palliative care and at the end of life, we're all, no matter what point it is in our life that we're experiencing this, we're going to experience it differently than the person next to us.
Absolutely.
I will say one of the things I always find so fabulous about folks that I get to work with in Hawaii is because our society is so diverse that you wouldn't last long. You never go in and say, oh, I'm going to assume people are like this. Right? So they may have a Japanese name, raised in Maryland, part of the military, and actually it's a big Hawaiian family. So you always have to ask and see what's going on and see how people are. And I think with gender identity, that's something hopefully people are becoming more conscious of. But I think you know, I thought there were so many interesting parts of your talk. You know, one of the things Alice Nagano put in about is thinking about her parents and their respective reactions. I will say, when my dad was coming to the end of his life he was in a long-term care facility, and just the differences of how that was. Dad, how are you? Couldn't be better. Let's see. You're in hospice care. You have gangrene, and they want to take off your foot. Actually, you could be better. Let me just tell you. But that was him. He wasn't going to complain. Men don't complain. My mother was much better about what was happening. And so I just still remember that because we're having a discussion about gangrene and his toe. Couldn't be better. You know what, Dad? You could be better. Let's talk about this. And also, like, he was never willing to tell the doctor there was a problem. So I always had to say, you know what? The pain's not good. He's complaining about that. Oh, let's not bother the doctor. Who else are we going to bother? Let's bother this doctor about this thing. So I really appreciate that. I don't know, Alice, did you want to say anything about what your parents are experiencing?
Not, you know, so this was super helpful because up to this point, up to today, I thought it was all about personality, you know, which is part of it too, I would say, but yeah, now that, you know, you kind of pointed out, like, now I'm thinking about my uncle and aunt, you know, like that. So thank you. I appreciate that. And I'm going to have to reflect and journal, you know, just like Tanya said. So thank you.
Great. I was interested too in people's idea about saying dying. I'm interested, do people say he died? Do people say he passed on? Because I notice sometimes people do say passed on because the people that they're with say passed on. I will say I think I told Jennifer this, that there was a family who said, oh, we lost Mom. And I said, oh, I'm so sorry. Yeah, she moved to Salt Lake City and is with my brother. Like, oh, okay. She was lost to you, I guess. And then she moved to Salt Lake City. So I find people are very euphemistic here, that people usually don't say death, dying. But I'm interested, what do professionals or people that work with, you know, folks here on the call, do folks like to say death, or do you say somebody's died? Do you say they've passed on, they passed away? Do you look to the family for inspiration?
I say died, and people don't often like it.
Yeah,
I trained me that way.
Tanya, I'm from way back on Hospice Maui, and Evelyn Civarolo, who was our clinical director at one time, was on a rampage about that. And she was like, why can't we just say they died? Why do we have to use all these euphemisms? And I would carry that forward to today. And I think that if those of us that believe, as I do, that part of our mission is to normalize the paradigm around death and dying and the fear, then it's obligate to us to say they died and not use the euphemisms, not skirt around it. I think that's certainly part of my mission.
But thank you, Rachel, and nice to meet a hospice ohana. We still continue to do that in my work in advanced healthcare planning. It's very important for us to always use those words. And while we come across times when people are uncomfortable about hearing or even saying the word, sometimes, you know, I find myself saying it after them, you know, oh, they passed away. And I says, oh, I'm sorry to hear that your dad died, you know, but in normalizing that whole thing about normalizing it, because then we wouldn't be true to the service that we do as what is it that we are, you know, as people helping the dying. You know, why do we skirt around that? I mean, people are very blatant with other things that they're saying in the world right now that sometimes I think aren't so important, and they want to make sure that people say it that way. Why can't we say what is the most important and actually the final thing that happens to us in life, and say death, dying, died, you know? Kick the bucket is one of my most disliked euphemisms.
Yeah. What was that other one? Carking? I didn't know that one. Is that an Australian term?
It's definitely British, and it's fascinating to me that it rose to the top from 3,000 people from 39 countries. You know, they must all have been like ex-colonial, for formerly British possessions, because I can't imagine that Carked would rise to the top of anyone's list in the U.S.
Oh, goodness. Yeah, we have a new term to confuse people.
Exactly. But I think,
Okay.
Bart, go ahead.
No.
I was just going to say that the thing that fascinates me about Bart's work is how little we are able to talk about dying, and when does that start? And when, what is it like? Because, someone's dying experience from, a massive stroke or, persistent vegetative state is going to be very different from the dying experience of someone who's got COPD or dementia, and yet, and unequivocally, all of those people are dying, but it's not the same experience, and it's not the same needs, and it's not the same setting, and it's not, we really do need a richer vocabulary around that. And as I've explained to Bart many times, his is not going to catch on. I'm sorry, but we need to think about, maybe there are ways that we can begin to match some terminology to those big trajectories, that we talk about, because those really do describe very, very different pathways to dying and different timeframes and different experiences. And if we could come up with some terminology that would be natural language that would be easily adopted, we might really begin to expand people's understanding of exactly where they are in this illness. Because I think that the worst thing that happens, and we encounter it all the time in palliative care and hospice care, is that people don't know they're dying.
Right.
And their family is suddenly shocked, after 18 years of emergency room trips. All of a sudden the person has expired, which is one of my, the worst term ever, and everyone's surprised. So anyway, it'd be interesting to think about that.
It's Tanya. Was there somebody else that wanted to go first?
No, we want to hear from you, Tanya.
Yeah, because I'm sitting here and I'm writing furiously on my paper, and one of the things that came up to me right now is that my dad, who died 10 years ago, I'm thinking about him now, and some of the wisdom that he taught us from such a young age. We were a farm family, and I don't know what the situation was, but my dad taught me that one of his words were, we begin to, the moment we're born, we begin to die the moment we're born. And that was like, what? But when you think about that, the process of being born already, it was the naturalization of what dying meant. So I just wanted to give a shout out to my dad, just in case he's listening. The other thing that I wanted to say was I wrote down what I thought was an acronym for the word care, as Jennifer was talking about it and really trying to put some clarity to it. And so I wrote down compassionate accompaniment, responding with empathy. And so that's listening to what is happening. You wouldn't be able to respond with care without knowing what it is that is needed, so that you can respond to that need, and doing it with compassion or from the heart. So that's another pointer that I think is going to be part of my toolkit moving forward. So I appreciate that.
Yeah, I was wondering if you have problems as you stop using the word care and start using other words like treatment. I'm going to practice this week and try to use treatment more often.
It's not easy.
No, and of course I use it all the time. It's very, it's what we say. And I liked your a treatment plan. I really like treatment plans. And I find in our world, people, it's not only they say goals of care, they say GOC. Like, oh, we've even forgotten that thing, which was kind of a euphemism for something else. So and shifting it up, it makes people listen to that. So
if I can share my screen one last time, I'll leave you with this image of a 12th century Ars Moriendi medal, and it expresses exactly what Tonya was just talking about. So you see this? Yes?
Yes.
So what this says is, as soon as we to be begun, we did begin to be undone. It's very much that same sentiment of we start dying the moment we're born.
Right. Well, this has been really great. Thank you so much. I really, obviously you see, Jennifer, people are interested and excited about what you presented, and thank you for letting us record it so that we can share it with those folks that weren't able to attend.
I'm sorry we had the glitch with the slides, but we figured it out. So
we used our language.
Yes, there's always
we used our language, and then we solved the problem. So I think that's great.
Well, thank you all so much for having me, and I'm gonna drop off and let you continue your conversation. But it was great to see everyone, and thank you so much.